A talented 19-year-old theater student returns home from a triumphant opening night. Hours later, her mother finds her lifeless in her bed, positioned as if she were sleeping. But the ligature marks on her neck and the tape residue on her wrists tell a different story. This is the story of Jessie Blodgett, a young woman whose final diary entry would prove tragically prophetic, and the unthinkable betrayal that followed. Before we begin, if you're passionate about seeking justice for victims and shining a light on cases that demand answers, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to Cold Case Beacon, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light. Now, let's dive into this case. 19-year-old Jessie Marietta Blodgett was a force of nature. A sophomore at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, she was studying theater with a focus that left everyone around her in awe. She had been awarded a talent scholarship for her excellence in the musical education program, a testament to her extraordinary gifts. Acting, musical theater, playing instruments, writing songs, if it was creative, Jessie excelled at it. And she had been this way since she was young. She was naturally gifted, yes, but never complacent. Never satisfied with being good enough. No one pushed Jessie harder than Jessie pushed herself. This drive, this determination, had been evident from her earliest years. When Jessie was in first grade, her teacher did something unusual. She created an entirely custom curriculum just for Jessie because this little girl was miles, and I mean miles, ahead of everyone else in her class. Her father, Buck, loved to recall those early days. He'd say that when other students were learning to spell words like and the, Jessie was spelling metamorphosis. Metamorphosis. In first grade. But Jessie wasn't just academically gifted. She had dreams. Big dreams. Her ultimate goal was to become a choir director, and it wasn't just about the music itself. Jessie believed, truly believed, that music could change the world. That it could touch people in ways that words alone never could. That it could heal, inspire, and transform. While working toward that dream, Jessie didn't sit idle. She was always moving, always doing. She started her own business teaching piano, voice, and violin to young people in Hartford, Wisconsin. And she was good at it. Really good. In just a couple of months, she had gained almost 30 students. 30. That's remarkable for someone so young, just starting out. But Jessie had a way with people, especially young people. She could inspire them, connect with them, make them believe in themselves the way she believed in herself. Beyond her studies and her teaching, Jessie volunteered. Every single summer, she'd give her time to the Central Middle School Orchestra, helping young musicians find their voice, develop their skills, nurture their passion for music. She didn't have to do this. She chose to. Because that's who Jessie was. And her activism didn't stop there. Jessie campaigned for causes she believed in. She talked about sustainable living, about environmental issues, about protecting our planet for future generations. She spoke out about violence against women, a cause that had become increasingly important to her in the months leading up to her death. She wasn't afraid to use her voice, to stand up for what she believed in, to challenge injustice wherever she saw it. On top of all of this, the studying, the teaching, the volunteering, the activism, Jessie worked every spare hour she could to earn extra money. She was building a life, building a future, one deliberate step at a time. The weekend of July 13th and 14th, 2013, had been an exciting and busy time for 19-year-old Jessie Blodgett. An incredible weekend, really. She was playing a fiddler in the local production of Fiddler on the Roof, and it was opening weekend. The culmination of weeks and weeks of rehearsals, of preparation, of anticipation. And it had been a triumph. Every single seat had been filled. The audience had loved it. The energy in that theater had been electric, and the cast had left that Sunday evening on a huge, huge high. They'd done it. They'd pulled it off. And now it was time to celebrate. The cast gathered for a pool party at a house that had a large llama pen outside. It was one of those quirky, fun details that makes a memory stick. Jessie was filmed poolside, laughing and splashing around. She had her photo taken with the llamas, smiling that beautiful smile of hers. In those moments, she seemed happy. Carefree. Just a 19-year-old girl celebrating a successful opening night with her friends. But when she returned home alone at 1 o'clock in the morning, something had shifted. Something had changed. Jessie's mother, Joy, was still awake when her daughter came through the door. And immediately, she could tell something was wrong. Jessie seemed upset. Troubled. Not quite herself. Joy asked what was wrong, and Jessie didn't say too much at first. But then she opened up a little. "The guys," she said. "They're always making passes, and I don't know why they always have to turn it there." Jessie explained to her mother that two men, both fellow cast members in their 40s, had made her uncomfortable at the party. One of them had tried to pull her onto his lap. Jessie had clearly not been okay with this. She'd been bothered by it. Bothered enough to tell her mother about it when she got home. But Jessie didn't just tell her mother. She wrote about it in her diary. Jessie was a writer, and like many writers, she processed her experiences, her thoughts, her feelings, by putting them down on paper. And what she wrote that night would later prove chillingly prophetic. In her diary entry that night, Jessie wrote, in part, "I think I'm being corrupted. I think certain men are taking what should be platonic love and perverting it into a competition." Let that sink in for a moment. Jessie recognized that something wasn't right. That boundaries were being crossed. That people she should have been able to trust were making her feel unsafe. And she was articulating it, naming it, trying to understand it. But Jessie didn't end her entry on that note. She ended with resolve. With determination. With the strength that had always defined her. "I appreciate the loving support of those in my life," she wrote. "I will recognize problems and confront them without fear. God be with me." She then closed the book, put it away, and went to bed. She had no way of knowing that those would be among the last words she would ever write. That within hours, her life would be taken from her in the most brutal way imaginable. A few hours later, at 8 o'clock in the morning on July 15, 2013, Jessie's mother, Joy, quietly entered her daughter's room to put some clothes away. It was a simple, ordinary task. The kind of thing mothers do every day without thinking twice about it. Jessie was in bed, lying still. She didn't stir when her mother entered. But Joy didn't think anything of it. Jessie had had such a busy summer, working, performing, teaching, always going. The girl deserved to sleep in. So Joy quietly placed the clothes where they belonged, shut the door with barely a sound, and left for work, letting her daughter rest. Joy returned home just after noon. The house was silent. Completely silent. And there was something about that silence that felt off. Jessie was supposed to be giving a piano lesson. One of her students knocked on the door at 12:30, right on time, ready for their lesson. Joy called for her daughter. "Jessie? Jessie, your student is here." No answer. Joy called again, louder this time. Still nothing. A knot of worry was beginning to form in her stomach. She headed upstairs to Jessie's bedroom, her footsteps quickening with each step. When Joy entered the room, Jessie was still in bed. Still in the exact same position she'd been in that morning. She was completely still. Not moving. Not breathing. Joy said her name again. "Jessie?" Her voice was shaking now. "Jessie, wake up." No response. Something was very, very wrong. Joy could feel it in her bones. Jessie's bed, which was usually messy, the bed of a busy, creative young woman who had better things to do than make her bed perfectly, was completely neat. Pristine, even. The blanket was wrapped around Jessie carefully, deliberately. It looked almost staged. Joy walked around to the other side of the bed, her heart pounding now, dread flooding through her body. She reached out to gently move her daughter, to shake her awake, and that's when she realized. Jessie was blue. Her skin had taken on that unmistakable color. The color of death. Joy's world shattered in that instant. She immediately called 911, and the call is absolutely heartbreaking to listen to. You can hear the panic in her voice, the desperation, the disbelief. She's trying to stay calm, trying to give the dispatcher the information they need, but her voice keeps breaking. My daughter is blue, she tells the dispatcher. I went to wake her up. I just got home for lunch and she won't wake up. The dispatcher asks if Jessie is breathing. Joy says she doesn't think so. She's cold, Joy says. She's cold. Oh my God. And then Joy sees something that makes her blood run cold. It looks like strangulation marks, she says. That's what it looks like. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's going on. When first responders arrived at the Blodgett home, they confirmed what Joy already knew in her heart. Jessie Blodgett, this brilliant, talented, passionate 19-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her, had been killed. As investigators processed the scene, the full horror of what had happened to Jessie began to emerge. And it was brutal. Absolutely brutal. There were ligature marks on Jessie's neck, indicating she had been strangled. But that wasn't all. There were deep abrasions on her wrists and ankles, as if she had been restrained. As if she had struggled against whatever was binding her. As if she had fought for her life. Jessie had clearly been strangled to death before being carefully positioned in her bed to make it look like she was simply sleeping. Someone had taken the time to do this. To stage the scene. To try to make it look like something it wasn't. Her hair and clothes were soaking wet, even all these hours later. It appeared that she had been washed after she was killed. Someone had cleaned her body. Washed away evidence. Tried to remove traces of what they had done. But here's what's crucial, there were no signs of forced entry into the house or into her room. None. No damage to the doors. No broken windows. No indication that someone had broken in from outside. Whoever did this had walked right through the front door. They either had a key or someone had let them in. Or, and this seemed increasingly likely, they knew the door would be unlocked. They knew they could just walk in. Police found a roll of tape underneath Jessie's bed. When they examined it, they found that it matched the marks on her body perfectly. This tape had been used to bind her, to restrain her. But here's the thing, the tape had not been in the Blodgett house before. Joy and Buck were certain of that. Which meant someone had brought it with them. Someone had come to Jessie's house with tape, with the intention of using it on her. Based on the evidence, investigators determined that Jessie had been killed sometime around 9 o'clock in the morning. Think about what that means. This was someone who knew the house. Someone who knew the family's schedules. Someone who knew that Buck and Joy would be at work. Someone who knew that Jessie would be home alone, asleep in her bed. Someone who had planned this. The fact that they had waited around after killing Jessie to stage the scene and wash her body added even more weight to the theory that this wasn't a random intruder. A random intruder would have panicked. Would have fled immediately. They wouldn't have stuck around to carefully pose the body, to wash away evidence, to try to make it look like Jessie had died peacefully in her sleep. One investigator later said that before Jessie's case, the small town of Hartford, Wisconsin, hadn't seen a homicide in almost 30 years. This was a safe community. A quiet community. A place where people didn't lock their doors because they didn't feel they needed to. Buck Blodgett would later say, I think it's as safe as it gets. There were 2 murders in Hartford in the 100 years before we moved here. Jessie was the third. As news of Jessie's death spread through the community, fear spread with it. If this could happen to Jessie, bright, beloved Jessie, in her own home, in broad daylight, then couldn't it happen to anyone? People started locking their doors, looking over their shoulders, questioning everyone and everything. But police made a statement that surprised many people. They said they felt the public was not in danger, that there was no ongoing threat to the community. This was an interesting thing to say, and it suggested that investigators already had some idea of what they were dealing with. That this wasn't a random attack by a stranger prowling the neighborhood. That Jessie had been specifically targeted. Investigators had to start somewhere, so they began with the most recent events in Jessie's life. Specifically, that pool party she'd attended the night before. The party where she'd been made uncomfortable by two older men. They tracked down the men Jessie had told her mother about. The 46-year-old who had tried to pull her onto his lap was interviewed. He denied any involvement in Jessie's death. He admitted that he'd behaved inappropriately at the party, saying his girlfriend would be really upset if she knew how he'd acted. But he insisted he had nothing to do with what happened to Jessie. Authorities weren't taking anyone's word for anything. They filed warrants to search both his phone records and Jessie's phone records. They also requested all of Jessie's Facebook data, looking for any clues, any communications, anything that might point them toward whoever had done this. When the phone records came back, both men from the party were cleared. Their phones placed them well away from Jessie's house that morning. There was no way either of them could have been at the Blodgett residence when Jessie was killed. Police also spoke to people at Jessie's work, going through everyone in her life with meticulous care. But again, everyone checked out. Everyone had alibis. Everyone was cleared. Days were passing, and investigators still didn't have a solid lead. Jessie's family was devastated, desperate for answers. The community was on edge, despite police assurances that there was no ongoing danger. Who could have done this? And why? Why Jessie? While the investigation into Jessie's death was ongoing in Hartford, something interesting was happening in nearby Richfield. Authorities there were looking into an attack on a woman in a park. And this attack had happened just days before Jessie was found dead. Just days. A woman named Melissa had been out walking her dog when she was attacked from behind by a man holding a knife. It was sudden, violent, terrifying. But Melissa was brave. Incredibly brave. She fought back. She actually grabbed the blade of the knife with her bare hands and fought her attacker off. He hastily jumped into his van and drove away. Melissa needed 15 stitches for the wounds on her hands where she'd grabbed the knife. But she was alive. And more than that, she was ready to help catch the man who'd attacked her. Once she was released from the hospital, Melissa went straight to the police. And she was, according to investigators, the best witness they had ever worked with. She could give an incredibly detailed description of her attacker, his age, his height, his weight, his hair color, his skin tone. She described his clothing. She described his vehicle, right down to the make and model. She took officers to the exact spot where he'd been parked, where the attack had happened, where he'd driven away. The detective working her case said he'd never interviewed anyone who could recall so much with such clarity. Melissa's mind had captured every detail, even in the midst of a traumatic, life-threatening attack. The vehicle she described, a dark blue minivan, a Dodge Caravan, an older model, sounded familiar to one officer. He regularly patrolled that park, and he remembered seeing that van in the parking lot several weeks before. Something about it had felt off to him. Something had made his instincts prick up. So he'd run the license plates, just to see what came back. But nothing suspicious had come up. The van was registered to a seemingly normal couple. There were no warrants, no red flags. So the officer had moved on, though he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Now, hearing Melissa's description, he realized his gut had been right all along. There was something wrong with that van, with whoever was driving it. And he had to track it down. The vehicle was registered to a couple in their 40s. Investigators looked into them, but neither the husband nor the wife fit the description of Melissa's attacker. They were too old, and the physical descriptions didn't match. But the couple had a son. A 19-year-old son named Daniel Bartelt. And Daniel? He fit the description perfectly. The age, the height, the build, the blonde hair, the fair skin, everything matched. Police called Daniel and asked him to come into the station for an interview. They wanted to talk to him about the attack on Melissa. And here's something interesting, Daniel didn't ask what they wanted to talk to him about. He just said he'd come in. Most people, when police call and ask them to come in for an interview, want to know why. They ask questions. They express confusion or concern. But Daniel didn't. He just agreed to come in. And where was Daniel when he got that call from police? He was at the Blodgett house. At Jessie's house. He was there for a memorial gathering, attending with other friends and community members who were mourning Jessie's death. He was consoling Jessie's parents. Crying with Jessie's friends. Sharing memories of the 19-year-old girl whose life had been so brutally cut short. He was very emotional, very talkative. In fact, one of Jessie's friends later said that Daniel had been doing most of the talking that day. He seemed devastated by Jessie's death. Heartbroken. Grieving. Here's something that nobody at that memorial gathering knew yet, something that would soon turn this entire case on its head. Daniel Bartelt was Jessie's ex-boyfriend. Buck said Daniel had always been around. He'd been part of their lives for years. Daniel and Jessie had sat next to each other every day in high school. They were both theater kids, both musicians. They had so much in common. They dated for several months, and their relationship had just made sense to everyone. They wrote music together, performed together, supported each other's creative endeavors. They'd even recorded a song together just 2 months before Jessie was killed. Jessie had posted it to her YouTube channel, proud of what they'd created together. Eventually, Daniel had ended the romantic relationship. But he and Jessie had remained friends. His parents later said that after Daniel dropped out of college after just 1 semester and came back home, he'd seemed different. The once jokey, playful, outgoing teen had become depressed, subdued, withdrawn. He wasn't quite himself anymore. When Jessie heard that Daniel had quit college, she was concerned about him. This didn't make sense. Daniel was a straight-A student. He'd always been excited about going to college, had always talked about his future plans. So what was going on with him? What had changed? But Daniel was back home now, back in the same social circle, back in the same community. And he and Jessie were seeing more and more of each other again. Before long, it was common knowledge among their friends that Daniel wanted to get back together with Jessie. He'd been the one to end things, but now he wanted to rekindle the romance. Jessie, however, was happy being single. She was focused on her studies, her teaching, her music, her activism. She had goals, dreams, plans. And she was content with where things were. She valued Daniel as a friend, but she didn't want anything more than that. As police sat down with Daniel to question him about Melissa's attack, they didn't yet know any of this about his connection to Jessie. They were there to talk about what happened in that park. About Melissa. About the knife. About the van. In his interview with police, Daniel was quiet. Very quiet. He'd sit in long periods of silence, not really giving investigators anything useful. Detective Joel Clausing asked him to walk them through his day on the Friday when Melissa was attacked. What had he done that day? Where had he been? Who had he seen? Daniel said he couldn't remember the specifics. He just couldn't recall. Which is an interesting thing to say when police are asking about a specific, recent day. Most people can at least give you a general sense of what they did a few days ago, especially when they're sitting in a police station being questioned. Investigators noticed that Daniel had some marks on his hands and arms. Scratches, abrasions. They asked him where those came from. Daniel said they'd come from working his shift. He worked a job that could be physically demanding, he explained, and sometimes he got scraped up. Police gave him another chance to tell the truth. Because here's the thing, they'd already done some checking. And what Daniel had just told them wasn't accurate. They told him they knew he'd actually lost his job a while ago. He wasn't working anymore. So those marks couldn't have come from a work shift, could they? Daniel went silent again. He was caught in a lie. And not just any lie, a lie that directly contradicted his explanation for suspicious marks on his body. Marks that could have come from a struggle. He was getting himself caught in lie after lie, backing himself into a corner. And investigators just kept calmly, methodically, closing in. Finally, Daniel had to admit what detectives already knew. He had attacked Melissa in that park. It was him. He'd been in the van. He'd come at her from behind with a knife. He'd tried to hurt her, and she'd fought him off. But why? Why would he do something like that? What possible motivation could there be for attacking a stranger in a park? Daniel's explanation was bizarre. Disturbing. He said, "I wanted to scare someone because everyone else is so confident. I don't understand it. I need someone to be like me." Think about that for a moment. He wanted to make someone else feel the way he felt. To strip away their confidence, their sense of safety, their peace of mind. To make them afraid. To make them vulnerable. To make them, as he put it, like me. Detective Clausing would later say that Daniel was clearly very intelligent and very self-aware. He understood himself, understood his own mind, in a way that many people don't. But instead of using that self-awareness to get help, to change, to grow, he'd used it to justify hurting someone. And that, Clausing said, just made his skin crawl. Daniel was placed under arrest for attacking Melissa. But the interview wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because now, investigators wanted to talk about Jessie. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "Justice for Jessie." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story and committed to remembering her name. Detectives asked Daniel where he'd been earlier that day, before he came to the police station. He told them he'd been at the Blodgett house. At the memorial gathering for Jessie. They expressed their condolences. "Sorry to hear about that," they said. "Were you close with Jessie?" Daniel hung his head. He seemed emotional. He said he couldn't believe that someone had done what they did to her. That someone had attacked and killed her. And that's when Daniel made a critical mistake. A mistake that would ultimately lead to his conviction for Jessie's case. At that point in the investigation, Jessie's body was still being examined by the medical examiner. The autopsy was still in progress. And no one, not the police, not the medical examiner, not anyone, had released any information about Jessie having been assaulted in that way. But Daniel, sitting in that interview room, revealed that he knew. He knew details about what had happened to Jessie that only her killer would know. Daniel Bartelt had just given himself away. When Daniel had been called in from Jessie's house earlier, no one had thought anything of it. Everyone assumed it was just routine questioning. Police were obviously going to want to talk to all of Jessie's friends, all the people in her life. It made perfect sense that they'd want to interview her ex-boyfriend. JOY Blodgett had even tried to reassure Daniel as he left. She'd turned to him and said, "Don't worry, Dan. It'll be okay. They're going to want to talk to all of Jessie's friends." Daniel had turned to his own friends and told them, "Okay, maybe you can come and pick me up in 30 minutes. He was very confident he wouldn't be at the police station long. He thought he'd go in, answer a few questions, and be on his way. But when his friends showed up 30 minutes later to collect him, officers were waiting outside. "We can't release Dan," they told his friends. "He's being detained." Impossible, everyone thought. There had to be some kind of mistake. There was no way Daniel could have anything to do with Jessie's death. No way. He loved Jessie. He'd been devastated by her death. He'd been at the memorial, crying and sharing memories. He'd been there for her family in their darkest hour. Surely the police had it wrong. Surely they'd realize their mistake and let him go. But that's not what happened. Because Daniel had revealed something he shouldn't have known. And once investigators started pulling that thread, everything began to unravel. Now officially in custody, Daniel was interviewed again. This time, he wasn't just someone they wanted to talk to about Melissa's attack. He was a person of interest in Jessie's case. Daniel admitted that he'd been in Jessie's home in the weeks before she was killed. But he'd kept it quiet. He hadn't told anyone. His explanation for this was that Jessie had made advances toward him during those visits. She'd tried to be romantic with him. But he was in a new relationship, he claimed, and he didn't want his new girlfriend to know that his ex was still interested in him. So he'd kept the visit secret. Investigators were very skeptical of this explanation. It didn't ring true. And it certainly didn't explain why Daniel needed to keep these visits such a closely guarded secret. Daniel told detectives that on the morning of Jessie's death, he'd been driving around in his parents' car. He was still pretending to have a job, still keeping up the charade that he was going to work every day, so he'd leave the house in the morning just like he had a place to go. He said he'd driven around for a while and then stopped at a park. Police immediately went to check surveillance footage from the park Daniel mentioned. And sure enough, there he was. The cameras had captured him arriving at the park. They'd captured him walking around. And, this is crucial, they'd captured him walking to the trash bins and disposing of something. Investigators rushed to that park. Fortunately, the bins Daniel had been seen approaching were still filled with the same trash. They hadn't been emptied yet. So whatever Daniel had thrown away was still there, waiting to be found. Officers pulled everything out of those bins, piece by piece, item by item. And what they found was damning. Absolutely damning. There was a cereal box that had been stuffed with ropes. There were items with biological evidence on them. And there was tape, the same type of tape that had been found under Jessie's bed. The same tape that matched the marks on her body. A search of Daniel's house and his bedroom turned up even more evidence. More rope. More tape. All of it consistent with what had been used on Jessie. When forensic analysts examined all of this evidence, they found both Daniel's and Jessie's DNA. They found Daniel's DNA under Jessie's fingernails, indicating she'd scratched him during a struggle. They found biological evidence that proved he had assaulted her. Daniel's laptop told an even darker story. The search history was disturbing. Deeply disturbing. He'd been searching for information about people who commit serial crimes, about violent crimes, about methods of harming people. One video in particular was exactly like what had happened to Jessie. It showed a woman being harmed, washed, and positioned in bed. Detective Clausing later said there was really no way to describe how disturbing some of these materials were. They painted a picture of someone who had been planning something terrible. Someone who had been researching, preparing, fantasizing about violence. Investigators also found something else on Daniel's computer. Parts of what appeared to be a novel. The title was Red is Red, and the author was listed as Joseph Bartelt. Joseph was Daniel's middle name. So he'd been writing under a slight variation of his own name. The novel focused on characters named Jessica and Dee. And in the novel, these characters engaged in violent acts, including one where someone was beaten severely using a pillowcase filled with toys. It was all there. The planning. The preparation. The evidence. This was as clear-cut a case as investigators had ever seen. Daniel Bartelt was formally charged with multiple felony counts. One count of first-degree intentional homicide in Jessie's case. And 3 additional counts related to the attack on Melissa, 1 count of first-degree recklessly endangering safety, and 1 count of false imprisonment, among others. As investigators pieced together what had happened on the morning of July 15, 2013, a chilling picture emerged. It appeared that Daniel had entered the Blodgett house around 9 o'clock in the morning, right after Joy and Buck had left for work. He knew their schedules. He'd been to their home countless times over the years. He knew exactly when they'd leave, exactly when Jessie would be alone, exactly when she'd likely still be asleep after her late night at the cast party. And he'd come prepared. He brought rope. He brought tape. He brought everything he needed. The prosecution would later refer to this collection of items as his kit. Because that's exactly what it was. A kit assembled specifically for the purpose of harming Jessie. Once he was inside, and remember, there was no forced entry, so he either had a key or knew the door would be unlocked, he went to Jessie's room. Jessie was asleep in her bed, exhausted from the weekend's performances and celebrations. Based on the physical evidence, what happened next was brutal. Daniel restrained Jessie, binding her wrists and ankles with tape. He gagged her and wrapped more tape around her face to keep the gag in place. Jessie fought back. The DNA under her fingernails proved that. She scratched him, struggled against her restraints, fought for her life. But Daniel was stronger. And he was prepared. He assaulted her. And then he strangled her to death with a rope. But he didn't leave then. He didn't panic and flee. Instead, he stayed. He washed Jessie's body, trying to remove evidence. He carefully positioned her in her bed, wrapped the blanket around her, made it look like she was simply sleeping peacefully. He staged the entire scene. And then, after all of that, he left. He drove to that park, disposed of the evidence in the trash bins, and went on with his day. He showed up at the memorial gathering at Jessie's house. He hugged her parents. He cried with her friends. He talked about how much he'd miss her, how tragic this was, how unfair. Daniel was someone that not a soul had suspected. How could they? He'd been Jessie's boyfriend. He was part of their community, their social circle. He'd been to the Blodgett home countless times. He was trusted. Welcomed. Loved. Buck later recalled something that, in hindsight, seemed significant. About a week before Jessie was killed, Jessie and Daniel had been at the Blodgett home alone, just playing music together like they'd done so many times before. When Joy came home from work earlier than expected, Daniel had turned to Jessie and asked, "What's your mom doing back so early?" At the time, the comment had struck Joy as slightly odd. Just a little bit off. But she hadn't dwelled on it. Now, looking back, both Joy and Buck wondered if that had been an earlier attempt. Had Daniel been planning to hurt Jessie that day, only to have his plan disrupted when Joy came home unexpectedly? They'd never know for sure. But the timing seemed too coincidental. Despite all the evidence against him, and there was so much evidence, Daniel pleaded not guilty. Which meant Jessie's family would have to sit through a trial. They'd have to hear every detail of what happened to their daughter. They'd have to see crime scene photos. They'd have to relive the worst day of their lives, over and over again, as the prosecution built its case. Joy Blodgett was the first person to take the stand. Can you imagine? Having to testify at your own daughter's case? Having to recount finding your child dead in her bed? It's unthinkable. But Joy did it. She answered every question, provided every detail, because she wanted justice for Jessie. Police had recorded video of Jessie's room on the day her body was discovered. The prosecution showed this video in court. The Blodgetts held each other close, trying to support one another as they watched footage of their daughter's bedroom, of the scene of her death. The video was difficult for everyone in that courtroom to watch, but it was necessary. The jury needed to see exactly what had been done to Jessie. The defense tried to fight the admission of this video, arguing that it was prejudicial, that it would inflame the passions of the jury. But the judge disagreed. The video wasn't being offered to excite the passions of the jury, he ruled, but rather to help the jury understand the crime scene. To understand what had happened in that room. The video was allowed. A detective took the stand and testified about the disturbing material found on Bartelt's laptop. He described the search history, the videos, the content that showed Daniel had been researching exactly the kind of crime he would later commit against Jessie. Investigators also testified about something they found telling. On the day Jessie died, it appeared that Daniel had tried to delete a video from his computer. A video called Jessie's Song, the song they'd recorded together just 2 months earlier. Why would he try to delete that unless he felt guilty? Unless he knew what he'd done and was trying to distance himself from Jessie? The assistant district attorney showed the jury the evidence that had been found at the park. The rope. The tape. The biological evidence. All of it pointing directly to Daniel Bartelt. The defense attorney tried to argue that it was all circumstantial. That these pieces of evidence alone weren't sufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That there were other reasonable explanations for all of it. But the jury didn't buy it. How could they? The evidence was overwhelming. Daniel's DNA under Jessie's fingernails. His DNA on the tape and rope used to bind her. Biological evidence proving he'd assaulted her. His search history showing he'd been researching this exact type of crime. His laptop containing a video that depicted almost exactly what happened to Jessie. His own slip-up in the interview, revealing he knew details about the crime that only the killer would know. The defense really didn't have much to work with. They couldn't offer an alternative theory. They couldn't point to someone else who might have done this. They couldn't explain away the mountain of evidence. They were, essentially, hoping the jury would have reasonable doubt despite all the evidence. But that was a long shot, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. Jessie's family, throughout this entire ordeal, conducted themselves with remarkable grace and dignity. Despite everything they were going through, despite the unimaginable pain they were in, they said they did not want to respond to Daniel or to what he'd done with hate. This might seem impossible to understand. How could they not hate the person who took their daughter from them? But the Blodgetts had always been people of deep faith and deep principle. And they were determined to honor Jessie's memory by living according to those principles. Something else remarkable happened during this trial. Jessie's family and Daniel's family were supporting each other. The Blodgetts recognized that two families had been devastated by this tragedy. They hadn't just lost Jessie. Daniel's parents had, in a sense, lost their son too. The boy they'd raised, the young man they thought they knew, had committed an unthinkable act. And the Blodgetts felt compassion for them. Buck said their first reaction when they learned it was Daniel wasn't hatred. It was disbelief and sadness. Our first reaction wasn't, "We hate this kid," Buck said. It was, "Oh my God, what happened to Dan?" On the day of the verdict, the jury deliberated for just 3 hours. 3 hours. That's remarkably quick for such a serious case. It showed that the evidence was, indeed, overwhelming. That there really wasn't much to debate. When the jury returned, the verdict was read, guilty. Guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. Guilty on all counts. Daniel Bartelt was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Jessie's case. For his attack on Melissa, he received an additional 5-year prison sentence plus 5 years of supervision. Many people criticized the sentence for the Melissa attack as being too lenient, given the seriousness of what he'd done to her. But regardless, Daniel would be spending the rest of his life behind bars for what he did to Jessie. Before Daniel was sentenced, both he and Jessie's family were given the opportunity to make statements to the court. Joy and Buck were hoping, desperately hoping, that Daniel would finally tell the truth. That he would take responsibility for what he'd done. That he would give them some kind of closure, some kind of explanation, some kind of acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. Daniel stood and addressed the court. He spoke calmly, almost detached, as if he were discussing something that had happened to someone else. He turned to Joy and Buck and said he couldn't give them the answers they were looking for. He talked about counting the days and hours since Jessie's death, claiming he did the same thing they did. He said there was no hiding from yourself in a tiny concrete cell. He claimed he had an innate ability to deceive himself, something he'd exercised too many times in his life, but that he refused to hurt anyone other than himself by doing that now. Then he said something that must have been incredibly painful for the Blodgetts to hear. He said, "This jumpsuit that I'm wearing, these shackles that I'm put in, don't make me guilty." He acknowledged that there was evidence he couldn't refute, evidence that would make people believe he was guilty. But he stopped short of actually confessing. Of actually taking responsibility. He claimed that the only reason he went to trial was because he wasn't allowed to enter what's called an Alford plea, a plea where a defendant maintains their innocence but acknowledges that the evidence against them is sufficient for a conviction. He said if he'd been allowed to do that, he wouldn't have put anyone through the trial. He talked about the judge, saying he didn't know whether he should fear him or respect him. That he struggled to understand how any human should be given the ability to condemn another human being. And then he said something truly incredible, "But I do know that I pity you." He claimed he couldn't prove his innocence to anyone, not even himself. He talked about Jessie, saying she was a beautiful person and that he still remembered her. And then he addressed Buck directly. "Buck," he said, "I think it's incredible that such ugliness has produced such beauty. And I've seen that from your entire family. I saw that the day after Jessie died when I was with you." He said he prayed for them all, that he believed someday he would be before a court that would know his conscience was grieved. And he ended with, "I love you and I'm so sorry for your loss." It wasn't the confession Buck and Joy had hoped for. It wasn't an acknowledgement of guilt. It was carefully worded, maintaining his denial while expressing sympathy for their pain. For many people in that courtroom, it felt like one last manipulation. One last attempt to control the narrative. Then it was Buck's turn to speak. And what he said was extraordinary. Buck Blodgett looked directly at Daniel Bartelt and said, "Dan, I forgive you, as I have every day since I learned it was you. I believe there is good and bad in every one of us, so I do not demonize or vilify you. To the good in you, and there is good, I say this, you are forgiven." But he didn't stop there. He continued, "But you will not know forgiveness until you tell the truth. For 457 days, you have lived a lie. As long as you are alive, you still have a chance to own what you did. I hope you take that chance." Buck then spoke about Jessie. "As for Jessie," he said, "she is now happy and free." And then he said something that many people in that courtroom probably couldn't believe. Something that showed the depth of Buck's faith and his commitment to living according to his principles, no matter how difficult. "Dan," Buck said, "I don't think there is any way on God's green earth that you or many in this room will understand or believe this, but it's true, I forgive you, and I love you. Of course, I hate what you did, but that doesn't mean I can't forgive and love." Can you imagine that? Speaking those words to the person who took your daughter's life? It's almost incomprehensible. But Buck meant it. He genuinely meant it. Daniel Bartelt didn't accept his conviction quietly. He appealed to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, arguing that the police had violated his constitutional rights by using statements he'd made during interrogation without an attorney present. But the court rejected his appeal. They found that his rights had not been violated, that the interrogation had been conducted properly, and that his conviction would stand. A month after Jessie's death, 500 people showed up for a vigil in her honor. 500. That's how many lives Jessie had touched in her 19 years. That's how many people wanted to gather together to remember her, to celebrate her life, to mourn her loss. And it was at that vigil that something beautiful was born. Something that would become Buck and Joy's mission, their purpose, their way of transforming unimaginable tragedy into something meaningful. They called it the Love is Greater Than Hate Project. It's a non-profit organization whose mission is to end violence against girls and women. It's about promoting forgiveness. It's about choosing love over hate, even in the darkest circumstances. It's about education, awareness, and prevention. The mission statement reads, ending interpersonal violence, promoting forgiveness, practicing love. Buck said that when this happened to Jessie, he started educating himself about violence against women. And he was shocked by what he learned. I had no idea how prevalent this issue is, he said, and how serious it often becomes. The family started the Love is Greater Than Hate project, and immediately, people began reaching out. People started sharing their own stories of violence, of trauma, of survival. It was unbelievable, indescribable, Buck said. And it's still going on. The goal is to speak at schools, at colleges, at community groups, even at correctional facilities. They share Jessie's story. They talk about the warning signs. They educate people about violence in relationships. They urge people to take a pledge against violence. To choose love. To choose respect. To choose to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. The community rallied around them. People bought t-shirts with the Love is Greater Than Hate message on them, spreading the word further with every shirt sold, with every conversation started. Buck explained why he does this work, why he puts himself through the pain of telling Jessie's story over and over again. Every day when I'm not living on purpose, he said, I'm in pain. And when I'm doing something and talking about love and forgiveness, then I'm good. He hopes that by sharing Jessie's story, other families won't have to go through the same pain. That young people will learn to recognize warning signs. That potential victims will know how to protect themselves. That potential perpetrators will get help before they hurt someone. Buck said something about his daughter that perfectly encapsulates what the Love is Greater Than Hate project is all about. This has been a devastating blow, he said, but honey, your strength is in me too, and love will always be stronger than hate. He continued, I forgive him every single day, and it's an ongoing practice because I get upset and I think about Jessie and what she went through. And it was brutal. Buck is honest about the fact that forgiveness isn't easy. It's not a one-time decision. It's a practice, something he has to choose again and again, every single day. Some days are harder than others. Some days the anger and the pain threaten to overwhelm him. But he keeps choosing forgiveness because he believes it's the only path forward. It's the only way to honor Jessie's memory and Jessie's values. Music was Jessie's passion. That's what she was known for. But in the months leading up to her death, speaking out against violence, particularly violence against women, had become increasingly important to her. It had become her cause. So in a way, the Love is Greater Than Hate project is a continuation of Jessie's work. It's Buck and Joy picking up where Jessie left off, carrying forward the cause she'd begun to champion. The family goes into schools, colleges, and even correctional facilities to share their story. They hope to educate, to inspire, to motivate people to choose love over violence, forgiveness over hate, understanding over anger. We are a message organization, not a service organization, Buck explains. The message is simple, end interpersonal violence through love and forgiveness. Buck said his daughter campaigned for many causes throughout her life. She was passionate about so many things, the environment, social justice, education, music. But violence against women was her last and biggest cause. She was just fiercely outspoken about that for a year or two before her death, Buck said. She was a really brave young woman, and she had a lot of causes. Ironically, her last and biggest cause was violence against women, and she tried to tell me about it. I listened, but I didn't fully understand until it happened to her. That's a powerful admission. Buck recognizes that Jessie was trying to educate him, trying to help him understand the prevalence and seriousness of this issue. He was listening, but he hadn't truly grasped it. Not until it affected his own family. Not until he lost his daughter to the very violence she'd been speaking out against. Now, he understands. And he's dedicated the rest of his life to making sure other people understand too. To making sure Jessie's death wasn't in vain. To making sure her voice continues to be heard, her message continues to be shared, her legacy continues to change lives. At Daniel's sentencing hearing, Buck Blodgett was given just a few minutes to address the court. Just a few minutes to try to put into words the impact of losing Jessie. Just a few minutes to speak on behalf of his daughter, who would never speak again. What he said in those few minutes was powerful. Profound. Heartbreaking. 10 minutes, Buck began. 10 minutes to sum up a life and explain in words to others the impact that the loss of that life has had on me. I should be able to shout out to the world daily until life leaves my body who this beautiful young person was, what she stood for, how deeply she touched so many, and how she has left behind a powerful legacy of love. And I intend to. He continued, in the weeks following her death, we received over 1,000 cards and letters. Never again will I end a long, hard, stressful day at work with a walk around the block with my girl, talking freely and deeply about everything under the sun. In her final month, she had developed a habit of starting every one of those walks with, "So, how was your day, Dad?" Buck's voice was heavy with emotion as he spoke. You could hear the love he had for his daughter. The pride. The loss. How can I describe for you the pain of this loss, he asked. I can't. It is there in the background and often in the foreground of my life every second. It will never go away. Others tell me that I will adapt to it, learn to function well with it, which I already have, but it will remain there and never go away. I know they are right. This is the reality of losing a child to violence. The pain doesn't go away. You learn to live with it, yes. You learn to function. But it's always there. A constant ache. A void that can never be filled. Jessie Blodgett's legacy lives on through the Love is Greater Than Hate project. Through the thousands of students who've heard her story and taken the pledge against violence. Through the countless conversations her case has sparked about relationship warning signs, about consent, about respect, about the problem of violence against women. Her legacy lives on in every person who chooses forgiveness over hate. Who chooses love over violence. Who chooses to speak up rather than stay silent. Who chooses to intervene rather than look away. Jessie wanted to change the world through music. Through her teaching. Through her activism. And in a way, she is. Just not in the way she imagined. Not in the way anyone would have wanted. But her voice continues to be heard. Her message continues to spread. Her impact continues to ripple outward, touching more and more lives every day. If this case moved you, if Jessie's story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Beacon, and share this story with others. Justice for victims starts with awareness. Change starts with education. Your support helps us continue shining a light on cases that matter, on victims who deserve to be remembered, on families who deserve to be heard. Drop a comment below telling us what stood out to you most about Jessie's story, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a case. Together, we can keep these stories alive and work toward a world where tragedies like this become a thing of the past. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to Jessie's story. And we'll see you in the next case. Remember, love is greater than hate. Always.